Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a topic so profoundly soothing, so wonderfully dull, it practically guarantees you'll be drifting off before I finish this sentence. We're talking about the napping habits of Victorian ghost hunters. Imagine, if you will, the flickering gaslight in a dusty, overstuffed drawing room. The air is thick with the scent of old velvet and perhaps a faint whiff of ectoplasm, or maybe just the lingering aroma of last night's treacle tart. You're huddled close, a sense of quiet expectation hanging heavy, not for a spectral appearance, but for the profound, inescapable wave of historical boredom about to wash over you. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported, not to a grand ball or a gritty industrial landscape, but to the quiet, often dimly lit, spiritualist parlors and haunted country estates of Victorian England. It's a world where the veil between life and death felt thinner, more permeable, to many, and where the relentless march of scientific inquiry began to brush up against the ancient whispers of the supernatural. This was an age of gaslight and burgeoning electricity, of corsets and Darwin, and, rather unexpectedly, of individuals who earnestly believed they could communicate with the departed. You might picture them as wild-eyed eccentrics, perhaps, but many were respected academics, doctors, and even members of the aristocracy, all united by a perplexing fascination with what lay beyond the material world. Think about the sheer societal shifts happening at this time. The Industrial Revolution had uprooted millions, science was challenging long-held religious beliefs, and a pervasive sense of loss, fueled by high mortality rates and devastating wars, created fertile ground for new ways of confronting grief and uncertainty. Mainstream historical fact: the Victorian era saw an unprecedented rise in the popularity of spiritualism, moving from fringe curiosity to a widely discussed, even fashionable, phenomenon. It wasn't just about comforting the bereaved, it was also about proving, empirically, that there was life after death, a challenge to the increasingly materialistic worldview of the time. And what about sleep in this context? You'd imagine someone actively seeking contact with spirits might need to be sharp, alert, perhaps fueled by strong tea and an iron will. But you'd be forgetting the sheer tedium, the endless hours of waiting in silent rooms, the repetitive rituals that formed the backbone of many spiritualist investigations. It wasn't always the dramatic, curtain-waving spectacle you see in period dramas. Often, it was simply waiting. And waiting, as you know, can be utterly exhausting. Historians still argue whether the spiritualist movement was primarily a religious revival, a scientific pursuit, or merely a popular form of entertainment. It was likely a complex blend of all three, with the promise of direct communication with the dead being a powerful draw. Consider a quirky tidbit from the time: some early spiritualist circles believed that a state of near sleep, a kind of waking trance, was ideal for receiving messages from the other side. They theorized that the conscious mind, with all its logical noise, needed to recede for the subtle vibrations of the spirit world to come through. So, rather than fighting sleep, some mediums and investigators actively cultivated a drowsy, liminal state. You might imagine them slumping gently in their armchairs, perhaps a chin slowly dropping to a chest, only to snap awake with a profound, if sometimes nonsensical, message. It makes you wonder if some of their more outlandish pronouncements weren't just the result of a particularly vivid dream, or perhaps, a desperate attempt to stay awake. It certainly puts a new spin on the phrase, sleeping on it, doesn't it? Perhaps they believed a good snooze was less about rest and more about opening a psychic portal, or at least making the long hours of waiting more bearable. As you settle deeper into this historical haze, you're observing the world of the mid-19th century, a time when the echoes of the Enlightenment still resonated, pushing for rational thought, yet simultaneously, an almost primal longing for the mystical began to reassert itself. This wasn't just about quaint parlor games. The rise of spiritualism was a profound cultural shift, a response to a world grappling with immense change. You see, the Victorian age, for all its emphasis on order and progress, was also deeply fascinated by the unseen, the uncanny, and the spiritual. It was a perfect storm of scientific curiosity, religious questioning, and the ever-present shadow of death. Mainstream historical fact: the mid-19th century witnessed a significant decline in traditional religious attendance in some urban areas, alongside a burgeoning interest in alternative spiritual practices. People were looking for answers outside the established church, particularly concerning the afterlife. This spiritual vacuum, combined with a general increase in literacy and the availability of printing, allowed new ideas, including spiritualism, to spread rapidly through society. You can almost feel the intellectual ferment in the air, a blend of hope and apprehension, as people tried to reconcile scientific discovery with their innate spiritual needs. Imagine, if you will, the dinner table conversations, one moment discussing the latest railway expansion, the next debating the veracity of a séance held just last week. The phenomenon wasn't confined to the working classes, either. You'd find dukes and duchesses, celebrated authors, and eminent scientists all dabbling in the spirit world, some as true believers, others as intrigued skeptics. They were seeking not just comfort, but empirical proof of an afterlife, a tangible connection to loved ones lost to the ravages of disease or conflict. It was a very human reaction to very human suffering, dressed up in the slightly eerie trappings of spirit rapping and table turning. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, many early spiritualists believed that the best time for spirit communication was during the liminal hours, the twilight period of dawn and dusk, or, more interestingly, during the deep quiet of the late night. This wasn't just poetic, it was thought that the world was quieter, the electromagnetic interference from daily life was at its lowest, and the human mind was naturally more open and receptive as it transitioned between states of consciousness. You can picture them, then, sitting in hushed rooms, waiting for the stroke of midnight, perhaps fighting off yawns, convinced that fatigue itself might be a gateway. It's almost as if they were performing a very drawn-out, very serious, and occasionally very dull, sleep study. This fascination extended to the concept of animal magnetism, or mesmerism, a precursor to hypnotism, which gained traction in the early 19th century. People believed that a magnetic fluid flowed between individuals, and that skilled practitioners could induce trances, cure ailments, and even access hidden knowledge through this manipulation. You can see how this idea easily morphed into the spiritualist belief that certain individuals, mediums, possessed a unique sensitivity, a kind of psychic magnetism, that allowed them to connect with the spirit world. It was all part of a broader search for invisible forces, a desire to understand the hidden mechanics of the universe, both physical and metaphysical. Historians still argue whether the widespread acceptance of spiritualism indicated a profound crisis of faith in established religions or a desperate search for scientific validation of immortality. Perhaps it was both, a cultural safety valve in a period of intense transformation. You might even find yourself pondering if, in a world without Netflix or constant digital distractions, the allure of a mysterious séance offered a form of thrilling, albeit slightly spooky, entertainment. It certainly beat another evening of needlepoint or a tedious lecture on agricultural reform. And who knows, maybe the flickering gaslight and the hushed atmosphere were simply the Victorian equivalent of ASMR, lulling participants into a state where their imaginations could run wild, whether spirits were present or not. The very act of waiting, of anticipating, would surely drain one's energy, making any subtle anomaly seem like undeniable proof. Your journey through this sleepy historical landscape now brings you to the epicenter of early spiritualism, a quaint farmhouse in Hydesville, New York. It's here, in 1848, that a peculiar series of events unfolded, forever changing the course of the spiritualist movement and giving rise to its most famous, or perhaps infamous, proponents, the Fox sisters. You're standing, in a metaphorical sense, right outside that humble dwelling, listening to the very first, tentative raps. Mainstream historical fact: the alleged communications initiated by Maggie and Kate Fox, through a series of unexplained rapping noises, are widely credited with sparking the modern spiritualist movement. These sisters, aged 15 and 11 respectively at the time of the initial phenomena, claimed to be communicating with a spirit named Mr. Splitfoot, later identified as a murdered peddler, through a code of raps. 1 rap for yes, 2 for no, and so on. You can imagine the scene, a family disturbed by inexplicable noises, attempting to make sense of them, and then, slowly, piecing together a system of communication. It was simple, compelling, and utterly captivating to a world hungry for proof of the afterlife. The story spread like wildfire, carried by word of mouth and the nascent popular press. Soon, the Fox sisters were demonstrating their abilities to eager audiences, first locally, then in larger cities like Rochester and New York. You might envision them as early Victorian celebrities, traveling from town to town, their performances a blend of wonder and controversy. People flocked to witness the phenomena, eager to believe, or perhaps, just to be entertained. For a quirky tidbit, it's worth noting that the sisters claimed the raps weren't just audible, they were often felt, vibrating through the floorboards and even the furniture. Imagine sitting in a room, perhaps a bit drowsy after a long day, and feeling a distinct tremor beneath your feet, followed by a series of precise knocks that spell out a message from beyond. It adds another layer of sensory input to the experience, making it all the more unsettling and, to many, convincing. Their early success spawned countless imitators and solidified the blueprint for future séances. You can almost feel the collective intake of breath as the first rap sounded, followed by the hushed whispers of the audience trying to interpret the message. But it wasn't just about the raps. As their fame grew, so too did the complexity of their alleged communications. They began to incorporate automatic writing, trance states, and even direct voice phenomena, where the spirit supposedly spoke through the medium's vocal cords. This escalation of phenomena further fueled public fascination, but also laid the groundwork for accusations of fraud. Historians still argue whether the Fox sisters were genuine mediums, masterful tricksters, or perhaps even self-deceiving individuals caught up in a phenomenon they initially couldn't control. Later in life, one of the sisters, Margaret, publicly confessed to having produced the raps by cracking her toe joints, though she later recanted this confession. This ebb and flow of confession and recantation only adds to the historical mystery, making it harder to discern the truth from the elaborate performances. You might find yourself wondering, if you were a Victorian observer, how easily you might have been swayed by such a compelling, yet simple, illusion. After all, who truly wants to believe that the comforting message from a deceased loved one was merely a cleverly disguised knuckle crack? The exhaustion for the sisters themselves must have been immense. Traveling constantly, performing multiple times a day, always under scrutiny, always on display. You can picture them, after a long evening of channeling Mr. Splitfoot, collapsing into bed, not just physically tired, but mentally drained from the constant performance and the weight of public expectation. Perhaps it was in these quiet, private moments that the fatigue of their unique profession truly set in, blurring the lines between their conscious deceptions and any genuine belief they may have held. The very act of sustaining such a grand illusion, or indeed, truly channeling such energies, would demand a peculiar kind of stamina, often punctuated, no doubt, by deep, restorative slumber. It certainly sounds more tiring than your average 9 to 5, even if the work hours were a bit more flexible. Having witnessed the spark ignited by the Fox sisters, you now find yourself ushered into the heart of the Victorian séance itself. This wasn't merely a casual gathering, it was a highly ritualized event, steeped in its own peculiar etiquette and an array of fascinating lore. You're no longer just an observer, but a silent participant, perhaps a bit stiff in your best dark attire, perched on an uncomfortable chair, ready for the ethereal show to begin. Mainstream historical fact, séances were meticulously choreographed affairs, often held in dimly lit rooms, with participants seated around a circular table. The subdued lighting, often gaslight or candlelight, was not just for atmosphere, it was also practical, as it helped obscure any subtle movements or trickery, and supposedly aided in the manifestation of spirits. You can almost feel the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight, blocking out the intrusive reality of the bustling Victorian street outside. The air might be heavy with the scent of incense, intended to purify the space and, perhaps, mask the smell of nervous perspiration. The rules were strict: no talking unless addressed by the medium, hands often clasped on the table to prevent tampering, and a pervasive atmosphere of hushed anticipation. This adherence to protocol was believed to create the optimal conditions for spirit manifestation. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, some spiritualists insisted that loose clothing and unfastened corsets, for the ladies, of course, were essential, as tight garments could restrict the flow of psychic energy. Imagine the rustling and adjusting before a séance, a chorus of sighs as Victorian ladies loosened their stays, all in the name of better spirit communication. It certainly paints a more relaxed, if slightly less prim, picture than you might expect. Perhaps it also explains why so many participants found themselves on the verge of nodding off. Comfort, after all, is conducive to sleep. The lore surrounding séances was equally elaborate. Certain days of the week were deemed more auspicious, certain objects, like lockets or photographs of the deceased, were placed on the table to aid connection, and specific incantations or prayers might be recited. You might hear the medium gently instructing everyone to breathe deeply, to clear their minds, to focus their collective energy. It was a blend of earnest belief, theatrical performance, and, at times, sheer gullibility. The goal, of course, was contact, a rap, a whisper, a disembodied hand, or perhaps even a full materialization. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in séance phenomena was a sign of genuine spiritual yearning or a reflection of the era's fascination with illusion and parlor tricks. It was likely a complex interplay. After all, the same period saw a boom in stage magic and conjuring, and the line between a genuinely believed spiritual manifestation and a clever magician's act was often blurry, particularly in the gaslight gloom. You can envision the subtle shifts in posture, the slight adjustments of the medium's chair, all potentially contributing to the perceived phenomena. The intense focus and stillness required during a séance would, undoubtedly, be incredibly draining. Imagine sitting upright, perfectly still, for an hour or more, straining to hear faint sounds, to feel subtle touches. Your eyes would grow heavy, your mind would start to wander, and the line between what you saw and what you thought you saw might begin to blur. It's not hard to imagine participants, and certainly mediums themselves, experiencing what modern science might call microsleeps or altered states of consciousness, where the suggestibility is heightened. Perhaps a slight nod was interpreted as a spirit's ascent, a gentle slump as the medium entering a deeper trance. The atmosphere, intentionally designed to be calming and slightly disorienting, could easily tip into an almost hypnotic state. No wonder a quiet nap after a particularly taxing séance was probably a welcome necessity, a deep descent into the oblivion of sleep after hours of ethereal anticipation. From the hushed solemnity of the séance room, your journey now takes a slightly more turbulent turn, into the realm of the infamous poltergeist. These phenomena, characterized by inexplicable noises, moving objects, and general chaotic disturbances, presented a different kind of challenge for Victorian investigators. You're no longer simply waiting for raps, you're bracing for flying furniture and inexplicable thumps in the night. Mainstream historical fact: unlike the more controlled environment of a séance, poltergeist activity was often unpredictable and disruptive, frequently centering around a particular individual, often an adolescent. These disturbances, ranging from unexplained rapping and knocking sounds to objects being thrown or furniture being moved, baffled and terrified households. The scientific community of the era, while increasingly rational, was still grappling with the boundaries of physics and the possibility of unseen forces. You can almost hear the frantic whispers in a darkened home, the sudden crash of a teacup, followed by the spine-tingling sound of footsteps when no one is there. Early attempts to rationalize and investigate these chaotic events often swung between attributing them to mischievous spirits and outright fraud. Investigators, often self-appointed, would descend upon affected homes, attempting to record, analyze, and debunk the phenomena. This was a far cry from the polite, seated séances. It involved long vigils, sleepless nights, and the desperate search for mundane explanations. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, some Victorian investigators, perhaps with a touch of gallows humor, would strategically place piles of flour or chalk dust around suspected areas to catch the footprints of an invisible perpetrator. Imagine the frustration of finding no footprints, or worse, finding tiny, inexplicable impressions that only deepened the mystery. It sounds less like a scientific investigation and more like an elaborate, very dusty, game of hide-and-seek with an invisible entity. The sheer physical and mental toll on those experiencing poltergeist activity, and on those investigating it, was immense. Sleepless nights were practically a guarantee. You can picture the exhausted family, perpetually on edge, their sleep constantly interrupted by unseen forces, leading to a state of chronic fatigue that could easily contribute to heightened suggestibility or even hallucinations. And for the investigators, the task was equally arduous. They would often spend days, even weeks, living in the affected houses, attempting to observe, document, and perhaps even provoke the phenomena. It was a rigorous, often frustrating, form of supernatural stakeout. Historians still argue whether many poltergeist cases were genuinely paranormal manifestations, cleverly executed hoaxes by bored or troubled adolescents, or even the result of complex psychological phenomena now understood as psychokinesis. The difficulty in conclusively proving or disproving these events left a lasting ambiguity. You might find yourself considering how much the stress of constant disruption, combined with severe sleep deprivation, could lead a person to interpret ordinary sounds as extraordinary occurrences. A creaking house, the settling of timbers, the wind whistling through a loose window pane, all could become terrifying evidence of a haunting to a mind starved of rest. The hunt for a rational explanation often involved elaborate setups, far beyond just flour on the floor. Some investigators would string fine threads across doorways, hoping to trip an invisible entity. Others would seal off rooms, looking for any sign of human entry. The dedication was undeniable, but the results were almost always inconclusive, leading to more questions than answers. The exhaustion must have been profound, a perpetual state of being on high alert, listening for that next inexplicable thump or crash. A quiet nap, a moment of oblivion, would have been an unimaginable luxury in such an environment, constantly overridden by the chilling possibility of the next disturbance. It makes you appreciate your own quiet nights and the predictable creaks of your home, doesn't it? Stepping away from the chaotic disruptions of poltergeists, your focus now shifts to a more organized, academic approach to the supernatural. You're entering the hallowed, if slightly dusty, halls where serious Victorian minds attempted to apply scientific rigor to the ethereal, the Society for Psychical Research. This was less about parlor tricks and more about painstaking, often tedious, investigation. Mainstream historical fact, the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, was founded in London in 1882, with the explicit aim of investigating alleged paranormal phenomena using scientific methods. Its early members included eminent scholars, philosophers, and scientists, many of whom were initially skeptical but open-minded. Notable figures like Henry Sidgwick, a Cambridge philosopher, and later Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, were involved. Their goal was not simply to believe, but to collect evidence, conduct experiments, and analyze data to determine the truth behind spiritualism, telepathy, clairvoyance, and apparitions. You can almost feel the intellectual weight in the room as these distinguished individuals debated the existence of unseen forces, armed with notebooks and measuring tapes rather than crystal balls. The SPR's methods were rigorous for their time. They collected thousands of eyewitness accounts, meticulously cross-referencing details, interviewing witnesses, and attempting to find naturalistic explanations for phenomena. They were particularly keen on debunking fraud, and their detailed reports often exposed the tricks of professional mediums. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, the SPR even developed specific forms for reporting apparitions, complete with questions about the time of day, lighting conditions, and the witness's emotional state, almost like an early, very polite, ghost sighting questionnaire. Imagine filling that out after seeing a specter float through your drawing room. Was the apparition well dressed? Did it appear before or after your afternoon tea? The SPR's investigations often involved long, arduous vigils in supposedly haunted locations, much like the individual ghost hunters you've already encountered. However, their approach was more systematic. They brought along equipment, rudimentary cameras, thermometers, and even early versions of electrical recording devices, to detect any physical changes during an alleged haunting. You might picture a group of impeccably dressed academics, armed with their scientific instruments, sitting in a cold, dark manor house, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The quiet, the stillness, the endless waiting, would be utterly conducive to drowsiness. Historians still argue whether the SPR's work ultimately advanced scientific understanding of consciousness or simply solidified the divide between believers and skeptics, without truly bridging the gap. While they exposed many frauds, they also published cases they considered genuine, leading to ongoing debate. You might consider how much of their scientific method was still colored by the prevailing cultural beliefs of the time, and how difficult it truly was to apply objective measurements to subjective experiences. After all, a slight chill in the air might be a draft, or it might be a spectral presence. The human mind, especially when tired, is adept at finding patterns where none exist. The dedication of these investigators was immense, demanding long hours and often traveling to remote locations. You can imagine the senior academics, accustomed to their cozy studies and regular mealtimes, suddenly enduring nights of minimal sleep, sustained by strong coffee and sheer intellectual curiosity, perhaps nodding off briefly in an uncomfortable armchair only to be jolted awake by a creak or a sigh. This blend of academic rigor and extreme patience, or perhaps, extreme exhaustion, formed the backbone of their approach. Their commitment to documenting every detail, no matter how small, speaks to a genuine desire for truth, even if that truth remained frustratingly elusive. It reminds you that even the most serious pursuits can have their moments of utter, sleepy tedium. Having observed the institutionalized efforts of the SPR, your focus now narrows to the individual figures who became synonymous with Victorian ghost hunting. These were the personalities, often eccentric, often brilliant, who dedicated their lives, and indeed, their sleep schedules, to the pursuit of the supernatural. You're walking among the true believers and the dogged skeptics, all united by a shared, peculiar obsession. Mainstream historical fact: prominent Victorian ghost hunters and psychical researchers often adopted highly personalized and sometimes unorthodox methods of investigation. Figures like William Crookes, a celebrated chemist, subjected mediums like Daniel Dunglass Home to rigorous, albeit controversial, tests, while others like Harry Price, though later, became renowned for their debunking efforts. Each brought their own background and biases to the field, creating a diverse landscape of approaches to the unseen. You might imagine them meticulously setting up cameras, long exposures, of course, given the technology, or patiently recording temperature fluctuations in a supposedly haunted room. Their routines were often dictated by the phenomena they chased. Hauntings, by their very nature, rarely adhered to convenient daylight hours. This meant long, solitary vigils through the dead of night, often in cold, damp, and uncomfortable surroundings. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, some ghost hunters believed that a period of sensory deprivation, often achieved by sitting in complete darkness and silence for extended periods, could heighten their own psychic sensitivity or make them more attuned to subtle environmental changes. Imagine the profound silence, punctuated only by your own breathing and the distant creaks of an old house. This practice, while intended to sharpen senses, could just as easily lead to profound drowsiness, blurring the lines between waking perception and dreamlike states. It's almost as if they were intentionally inducing a state of mild sleep deprivation, believing it opened a door to the spirit world, when in reality, it might have just opened the door to a very vivid hallucination. The sheer exhaustion must have been profound. These weren't always professional endeavors with set hours. Many were passionate amateurs, fitting their investigations around demanding careers and family lives. You can picture a distinguished doctor, after a long day tending to patients, then spending his entire night in a chilly, allegedly haunted attic, armed with a notebook and a flickering lantern, only to return to his practice in the morning, running on fumes. The line between dedication and obsession certainly blurred in many cases. Historians still argue whether the personal biases and theoretical leanings of these prominent investigators ultimately shaped their findings, leading them to see what they wanted to see, or if their genuine attempts at objectivity pushed the boundaries of scientific inquiry. The very act of believing in the phenomena could influence perception, especially when tired. You might consider how a slight drop in temperature, easily explained by a draft, could be interpreted as a ghostly presence by someone who has been waiting for hours in the dark, desperate for a sign. The lack of consistent, standardized methods across individual investigators meant that findings were often difficult to replicate or verify. Each hunter had their own preferred tools, their own theories, and their own rituals. Remember William Crookes and his controversial experiments with D.D. Home. He built a reputation on the belief that home could defy gravity, a feat of scientific observation that, in hindsight, seems almost too fantastical. Yet, at the time, it convinced many leading minds. It reminds you that even the most rigorous minds can be swayed by phenomena they cannot immediately explain, especially when their own sleep-deprived brains are working overtime in the dead of night, straining for that elusive proof. A hard day's work, followed by a harder night's vigilance, undoubtedly led to some very unusual conclusions, often born in that twilight state between wakefulness and sleep. As your journey continues through the peculiar world of Victorian ghost hunting, you now arrive at a fascinating, if somewhat clunky, intersection: the early attempts to employ technology in the pursuit of the paranormal. This wasn't about spectral manifestations from thin air, it was about trying to capture the ethereal using the very latest, often experimental, scientific instruments of the age. You're stepping into the laboratory of the ghost hunter, where gaslight meets nascent electricity. Mainstream historical fact: the late Victorian era saw the enthusiastic application of new scientific inventions to the investigation of supernatural phenomena. Early photography, phonographs, and even rudimentary electrical sensors were employed by investigators hoping to capture evidence that the human senses alone could not. This was a direct response to the era's growing scientific materialism: if something was real, it could be measured, recorded, and analyzed. You can almost hear the whirring of an early phonograph, hoping to record a disembodied voice, or the click of a camera shutter, capturing a faint, blurry image on a glass plate negative. The limitations of these early technologies, of course, were immense. Photography, for instance, required long exposure times, meaning any subtle movement would result in a blur or an absence of an image. This, ironically, sometimes led to unintended, ghostly effects. A person moving slightly during a long exposure might appear as a translucent figure, or disappear entirely, leading to claims of spirit photography. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, some particularly optimistic investigators even tried using early seismographs, designed to detect earthquakes, to pick up the vibrations of ghostly footsteps or poltergeist disturbances. Imagine the delicate needle on a smoked glass, tracing erratic lines, with the investigator poring over them, trying to discern the difference between a spectral stomp and a rattling windowpane. It sounds utterly futile, doesn't it, but their earnestness was undeniable. The deployment of these devices often meant even more prolonged vigils. Setting up and monitoring cumbersome equipment in the dead of night, often in cold, damp, and unlit locations, required immense patience and endurance. You can picture the investigator huddled over a temperamental battery, trying to get enough power for a single, fleeting reading, or waiting for hours for the perfect, static conditions for a photographic plate. This technological pursuit of the paranormal was a slow, deliberate process, utterly devoid of dramatic flair, and rich with the potential for profound boredom and, yes, sleepiness. Historians still argue whether the use of these early technologies genuinely contributed to the understanding of alleged paranormal phenomena, or merely reflected the era's uncritical faith in scientific progress as a panacea for all mysteries. It's a good question. You might consider how easily an investigator, exhausted from a night of monitoring, might misinterpret a faint hum from their electrical apparatus as a spirit's whisper, or a chemical anomaly on a photographic plate as a spectral presence. The human brain, particularly when tired, is a master of pattern recognition, sometimes finding patterns where only random noise exists. The sheer effort involved in these early attempts highlights the dedication of these pioneers. They weren't just sitting and waiting, they were actively trying to innovate, to bring the tools of modernity to bear on ancient mysteries. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from our earlier, hypothetical discussion? Just as ancient Egyptians used crude methods for protection, Victorians were using crude methods for detection. The very act of operating such equipment, constantly checking gauges, adjusting lenses, and replacing batteries, would be a monotonous, soporific task. It's no surprise that a brief, unintentional nap might have been a frequent companion to these tech-savvy, yet fundamentally human, ghost hunters in the quiet, electrically humming darkness of their haunted vigils. Having witnessed the earnest, if often unavailing, attempts to capture spirits with nascent technology, you now shift your gaze to a more cynical, yet equally fascinating, aspect of Victorian spiritualism, the pervasive presence of skepticism and the frequent unmasking of hoaxes. This was an age of both profound belief and shrewd cunning, where the line between true mediumship and outright fraud was constantly, and often dramatically, blurred. You're now a detective of deception, peering through the carefully constructed illusions. Mainstream historical fact, alongside the boom in spiritualism, there was a robust counter-movement of professional magicians, scientists, and journalists dedicated to exposing fraudulent mediums. Figures like the famous illusionist Harry Houdini, though his prime was slightly later, the spirit of debunking was strong in the Victorian era, tirelessly demonstrated how alleged supernatural feats could be replicated through clever sleight of hand, mechanical devices, or psychological manipulation. Public lectures and demonstrations revealing the tricks of the trade were immensely popular, drawing crowds as large as, if not larger than, those attending séances. You can almost hear the gasps of the audience as a spirit hand that once appeared to float in the air is revealed to be a simple wooden contraption operated by the medium's foot. The exposure of hoaxes was a constant battle, a cat-and-mouse game between those who sought to mystify and those who sought to demystify. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, some debunker magicians would attend séances disguised as ordinary attendees, carrying hidden instruments like miniature calipers to measure the length of spirit trumpets or secretly marking mediums' hands with indelible ink to prove they were manipulating objects. Imagine the tension in the room, the medium attempting to conjure a spirit, completely unaware that a skeptical sleuth is meticulously documenting every subtle twitch. It adds a layer of spy thriller intrigue to the otherwise somber atmosphere of a séance. The psychological toll on both the mediums, living in constant fear of exposure, and the debunkers, perpetually on alert for trickery, must have been considerable. Sleep, for both parties, would likely have been fitful, haunted by the specter of discovery or the frustration of persistent deception. You can picture the medium, after a successful, fraudulent séance, lying awake, replaying every movement, every subtle misdirection, ensuring no detail was missed, lest their entire livelihood collapse. Conversely, the debunker might spend sleepless nights trying to unravel a particularly stubborn illusion, their mind churning with possibilities, unable to rest until the trick was revealed. Historians still argue whether the widespread exposure of fraudulent mediums ultimately strengthened or weakened the spiritualist movement in the long run. On one hand, it validated the skeptics and certainly put many charlatans out of business. On the other hand, some true believers simply rationalized that the fakes made the real phenomena even more exceptional, and that true spiritualism was simply being unfairly maligned by cynical materialists. You might find yourself pondering how easily a person, desperate for connection or proof, could dismiss undeniable evidence of trickery, choosing instead to cling to the hope of genuine spiritual interaction. The human capacity for self-deception, especially when tired and emotionally vulnerable, is truly remarkable. The constant vigilance required to detect fraud, or to perpetrate it, would certainly drain one's mental and physical reserves. The debunkers, in particular, spent countless hours observing, analyzing, and strategizing, often under conditions that were intentionally designed to confuse and disorient. This high-stakes game of wits left little room for peaceful slumber. Perhaps a successful expose was the only thing that allowed for a truly restful night, a well-deserved, if momentary, reprieve from the constant search for truth in a world rife with illusion. Leaving behind the debates of genuine or fraudulent phenomena, your journey now guides you into a different, more internal realm of Victorian belief, the mysterious world of dreams and premonitions. For many in this era, the sleeping mind was not simply a place of rest, but a potential conduit for messages from the spiritual world, a space where the veil between realms thinned, perhaps even more so than in a séance. You're now exploring the unconscious landscape, where logic sometimes yields to intuition and the echoes of the beyond. Mainstream historical fact: Victorians, influenced by both traditional folklore and emerging psychological theories, often placed significant emphasis on dreams as sources of hidden meaning, warnings, or even direct communication from deceased loved ones. Dream interpretation was a common practice, with books and articles offering guidance on deciphering the symbolism within nocturnal visions. Unlike the often public and performative nature of séances, dreams offered a private, intimate form of spiritual experience, accessible to anyone. You can imagine a Victorian individual waking in the quiet dawn, pondering a particularly vivid dream, wondering if it held a message from their departed mother or a warning about an upcoming business venture. This belief in the prophetic or communicative power of dreams extended beyond the purely personal. Accounts of premonitions, particularly those concerning death or disaster, were widely circulated and discussed. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, some spiritualists and psychical researchers meticulously kept dream diaries, recording their nightly visions in detail, hoping to find patterns, common symbols, or even evidence of shared dreams among sensitive individuals. Imagine the dedication, meticulously documenting every fleeting image, every bizarre narrative, even after a particularly restless night, all in the hope of uncovering a hidden truth. It sounds like an early form of self-analysis, mixed with a dash of supernatural detective work. The role of sleep in these phenomena was paramount. It was understood that the conscious mind needed to be quieted, its logical functions suspended, for these deeper, more intuitive messages to surface. This meant that the act of falling asleep, and the state of sleep itself, was imbued with a certain sacred quality for those seeking spiritual insights. You might picture them actively trying to induce certain dreams through focused thought before bed, or attempting to lucid dream in order to travel to the spirit world. Of course, the reality of dreams is often far less coherent than their desired messages. Historians still argue whether the Victorian fascination with dreams and premonitions was a genuine attempt to understand the subconscious, a manifestation of anxieties about a rapidly changing world, or simply a culturally sanctioned way to process grief and uncertainty. It was likely a complex interplay. You might consider how a particularly vivid nightmare, perhaps brought on by a rich supper or indigestion, could easily be interpreted as a dire premonition by a mind already primed to seek supernatural signs, especially in an era without modern understanding of sleep cycles or the physiological basis of dreams. The boundaries between waking life and the dream world were, in many ways, far more porous for Victorians. The concept of a good night's sleep for a Victorian seeking spiritual enlightenment through dreams wasn't necessarily about deep, uninterrupted rest, but about achieving a particular state of mind that was receptive to these subtle influences. The practice of trying to remember dreams upon waking, often disrupting the sleep cycle, would certainly contribute to a form of chronic fatigue. It meant that even rest itself was a form of work, a pursuit of knowledge. So, while you might envy their perceived direct line to the spiritual world, remember that it often came at the cost of truly restorative slumber, leaving them in a perpetual state of half-awake, half-asleep introspection. Moving deeper into the twilight zone between wakefulness and slumber, your focus now shifts to another peculiar aspect of Victorian interest in altered states, the phenomena of sleepwalking and other nocturnal anomalies. For a society increasingly fascinated by the workings of the mind, these unconscious nocturnal journeys presented both a scientific puzzle and, for some, another potential window into the mysterious or even the spiritual. You're observing the silent, eerie movements of those adrift in the realm of night. Mainstream historical fact, sleepwalking, or somnambulism as it was scientifically termed, was a topic of considerable fascination and medical inquiry in the Victorian era. It was often linked to hysteria, nervous disorders, or even seen as a manifestation of a deeper, unconscious mind at work, long before Freud made it fashionable. Accounts of individuals performing complex tasks, speaking, or even leaving their homes while utterly asleep filled medical journals and popular imagination. This wasn't just a quaint oddity, it was a genuine concern and a source of considerable debate about the nature of consciousness. You can imagine the hushed conversations among family members, perhaps finding a loved one inexplicably downstairs in the middle of the night, their eyes open but vacant, utterly unaware of their surroundings. Theories abound concerning the causes and implications of sleepwalking. Some believed it was the result of a disembodied spirit temporarily inhabiting the sleeper, or perhaps the sleeper's own spirit wandering outside the body. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, a few psychical researchers even attempted to communicate with sleepwalkers, believing that the somnambulistic state allowed for heightened psychic receptivity or access to hidden knowledge. Imagine an investigator gently questioning a sleepwalker, hoping for a profound spiritual revelation, only to be met with incoherent babbling or simply a blank stare. It sounds like a scene straight out of a Gothic novel, blending scientific curiosity with a healthy dose of the supernatural. The intersection of sleepwalking with spiritualism was particularly intriguing. If the body could perform actions without conscious intent, perhaps it could also be a vessel for external forces. This lent a certain mystique to the act of sleep itself, transforming it from mere biological necessity into a potential site for extraordinary phenomena. You might consider how a genuine sleepwalking episode could be misinterpreted as a ghostly manifestation or an act of spiritual possession by those predisposed to believe in such things, especially in a dimly lit, gaslit home. The shadowy figures moving silently through the night would certainly be unsettling, even if the explanation was purely physiological. Historians still argue whether the widespread interest in sleepwalking in similar altered states reflected a growing understanding of the human psyche or a continued reliance on supernatural explanations for unexplained physiological phenomena. It was likely a blend of both, a tentative step towards modern psychology while still tethered to older, mystical interpretations. You might ponder how much of the Victorian understanding of sleep and consciousness was shaped by limited scientific tools and a cultural environment that readily accepted the existence of unseen forces. The lack of EEG machines or sophisticated sleep labs meant that observation was often the only tool, and observation, particularly in the dark, can be highly subjective. The presence of sleepwalkers in the household must have added another layer of anxiety and vigilance for those responsible for their care, further contributing to disrupted sleep patterns for the entire family. For the sleepwalker themselves, the mysterious nature of their nocturnal wanderings would be a source of confusion and perhaps even fear upon waking. The idea that their own body could betray them, acting independently in the dead of night, would surely be disquieting. So, while you might find the concept fascinating, imagine the sheer exhaustion of living in a home where the nights were not for peaceful rest, but for inexplicable activity, making a truly restorative night's sleep a rare and precious commodity. You're now delving into one of the more unusual, and frankly, counterintuitive aspects of Victorian ghost hunting and spiritualism, the peculiar belief that short naps, far from being a sign of laziness, could actually enhance psychic receptivity. This wasn't about avoiding exhaustion, it was about intentionally entering a liminal state, a kind of drowsy bridge between worlds. You're observing the very deliberate act of strategic dozing. Mainstream historical fact, while rigorous scientific investigation of sleep was in its infancy, many spiritualists and psychical researchers held a folk belief that a state of hypnagogia, the transitional state between wakefulness and sleep, was particularly conducive to receiving spiritual messages or experiencing psychic phenomena. This wasn't about deep, restorative sleep, but about that fleeting, dreamlike awareness right before or after conscious slumber. You can imagine a medium settling into an armchair, not for a long rest, but for a deliberate 15-minute power nap, hoping to awaken with a fresh influx of ethereal insights. This notion was rooted in the idea that the conscious, logical mind, with its constant chatter and analytical processes, acted as a barrier to the subtle vibrations of the spirit world. By quietening the waking mind through a brief period of drowsiness or light sleep, the subconscious, or psychic mind, was believed to become more open and receptive. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, some mediums would specifically arrange their napping spaces to be in quiet, dimly lit rooms, often with specific scents like lavender or frankincense, believing these atmospheric elements further aided in opening the psychic channels. Imagine a Victorian ghost hunter meticulously preparing their psychic napping nook, complete with a cozy blanket and perhaps a small dish of aromatic herbs, all in the service of catching a whisper from the great beyond. It's certainly a more elaborate ritual than your average afternoon snooze. The concept was that these short, semi-conscious states allowed for a less filtered flow of information, whether from spirits, the collective unconscious, or even just the individual's own heightened intuition. It put a very practical, if somewhat odd, spin on the phrase, "I'll sleep on it." For them, it was less about problem-solving and more about spiritual reception. You might find yourself wondering if these psychic naps were truly portals to the spirit world, or simply moments where the brain, in its drowsy state, became more prone to suggestion, association, and vivid, if fleeting, imagery. Historians still argue whether these practices genuinely facilitated paranormal experiences or primarily served as a psychological mechanism to enhance suggestibility and interpret random thoughts as meaningful messages. It's a fascinating debate. You might consider how easily a quick nap, especially in a quiet, expectant environment, could lead to waking dreams or a feeling of profound insight that, in a fully alert state, might be dismissed as mere fantasy. The power of expectation, combined with a slightly altered state of consciousness, could be a potent brew for perceived psychic phenomena. The irony, of course, is that while attempting to enhance psychic abilities, these individuals were likely accumulating a sleep debt from their long, nocturnal investigations. So, these short, tactical naps might have been as much about managing profound fatigue as they were about opening psychic channels. A tired brain, after all, is often a more creative, less inhibited brain, prone to flashes of insight or moments of disorientation that could easily be interpreted as spiritual communication. This peculiar blend of scientific curiosity, spiritual yearning, and a deep, underlying weariness made the Victorian ghost hunter's relationship with sleep and particularly with the humble nap, a truly unique and often contradictory affair. Having explored the strategic nap, your attention now turns to the true crucible of Victorian ghost hunting, the dreaded, yet eagerly anticipated, overnight stay in a purportedly haunted house. This was the ultimate test of nerve, patience, and endurance, a direct confrontation with the unknown within the very walls where the supernatural was rumored to dwell. You're no longer merely observing, you're feeling the chilling drafts and the oppressive silence of a forgotten past. Mainstream historical fact: it was common practice for dedicated ghost hunters, psychical researchers, and even curious individuals to spend extended vigils, often overnight, in houses rumored to be haunted. These overnight stays were considered essential for gathering first-hand evidence of spectral activity, observing phenomena over a prolonged period, and debunking claims of fraud by controlling the environment. You can almost feel the dampness in the air of an abandoned drawing room, the scent of mildew and decaying wood, as you settle in for a long, unsettling night. These vigils were rarely comfortable. Victorian haunted houses were often cold, poorly lit, and filled with the natural creaks and groans of old structures settling. Investigators would equip themselves with lanterns, notebooks, and perhaps a flask of brandy, enduring hours of silent waiting. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, some investigators would rig up elaborate systems of bells, strings, and even flower traps across doorways or staircases, hoping to detect any movement by an unseen entity during the night. Imagine the frustration of being jolted awake by a false alarm, a mouse scuttling or an old timber shifting, only to find the trap undisturbed, leaving you in a state of heightened anxiety and further robbing you of precious sleep. It sounds less like an investigation and more like an elaborate, self-inflicted torture session designed to maximize paranoia. The psychological impact of these prolonged vigils cannot be overstated. Sleep, if it came at all, would be light and easily disturbed, constantly on edge for the slightest sound or movement. The mind, starved of rest and operating in a state of heightened suggestibility, could easily interpret mundane sounds, the wind whistling through a broken pane, the scratching of branches against glass, the settling of floorboards, as definitive proof of a haunting. You might find yourself staring into the oppressive darkness, convinced that every shadow holds a lurking presence, every subtle sound a ghostly whisper. Historians still argue whether the physical and mental exhaustion induced by these overnight stays actually contributed to the perceived phenomena, leading to misinterpretations or even hallucinations, rather than genuine evidence of ghosts. It's a compelling argument. You might consider how a lack of restorative sleep could amplify anxieties, impair judgment, and make one more susceptible to imaginative interpretations of ambiguous stimuli. The very act of expecting a ghost to appear could, for a sleep-deprived mind, cause one to see a ghost where none existed. The dedication required for these extended vigils was immense, demanding a peculiar kind of stoicism from the Victorian ghost hunter. They willingly subjected themselves to discomfort, fear, and profound sleep deprivation, all in the name of unraveling the mysteries of the beyond. This commitment, while admirable, often blurred the lines between objective research and an almost spiritual quest. So, while you might find the idea of spending a night in a haunted mansion thrilling, remember the cost, the chilling cold, the pervasive silence, and the almost unbearable weight of exhaustion, making any fleeting moments of rest less about comfort and more about the desperate need for even a few minutes of oblivion, before the next unexplained creak jolted them back into the chilling reality of their vigil. Having spent a restless night in a haunted house, you now acutely feel the cumulative effect of these peculiar pursuits, the profound physical toll exacted upon the tireless Victorian ghost hunters. This wasn't a sedentary hobby, it was an often arduous endeavor, demanding stamina, resilience, and a stubborn disregard for personal comfort and, most significantly, sleep. You're observing the slow, steady erosion of their well-being. Mainstream historical fact, the rigorous demands of psychical investigation, particularly overnight vigils and extensive travel to remote, often uncomfortable locations, frequently led to chronic fatigue, illness, and general physical deterioration among dedicated Victorian ghost hunters. Unlike modern researchers who might work within controlled environments, these pioneers often subjected themselves to harsh conditions, cold, damp buildings, irregular meals, and, critically, severely disrupted sleep patterns. You can almost see the dark circles under their eyes, the slight tremor in their hands as they attempt to write notes, the general air of weariness that pervaded their very being. Beyond the obvious lack of sleep, these investigations often involved prolonged periods of mental and emotional strain. The constant anticipation of phenomena, the pressure to identify or debunk, and the psychological impact of being in potentially unsettling environments all contributed to a pervasive sense of exhaustion. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, some particularly devoted investigators were known to carry small, personal remedies for their ailments, perhaps a bottle of laudanum for nervous jitters, or a pungent-smelling salt to ward off fainting spells brought on by sheer exhaustion and the stuffy atmosphere of a séance. Imagine a Victorian gentleman, on the verge of nodding off, taking a quick sniff of ammonia to sharpen his senses, only to be left with watering eyes and an even stronger desire for a proper nap. The social ramifications of their unconventional pursuits also added to their stress. While some were celebrated, others faced ridicule, accusations of mental instability, or social ostracism. This constant external pressure, combined with the internal demands of their work, made true relaxation and restorative sleep incredibly difficult to achieve. You might find yourself pondering the internal struggle of a respected academic, torn between their scientific curiosity and the societal judgment that came with dabbling in the supernatural. Such internal conflict is certainly not conducive to peaceful slumber. Historians still argue whether the physical and mental fatigue experienced by these investigators actually colored their perceptions, making them more susceptible to misinterpreting stimuli or even experiencing hallucinations that they attributed to supernatural causes. It's a compelling point. You can easily imagine how a tired brain, desperate for coherence, might weave a narrative around ambiguous sensory input, turning a creaking floorboard into ghostly footsteps, or a trick of the light into an ethereal figure. The line between external reality and internal perception blurs considerably when the mind is starved of its necessary rest. The dedication to their craft, regardless of the ultimate veracity of their findings, was undeniable. They pushed the boundaries of human endurance in their quest for answers. This often meant sacrificing their personal well-being, including the fundamental need for consistent, quality sleep. Remember those long exposure photographs? The investigator would have to remain perfectly still for minutes, sometimes hours, in the dark, often shivering, constantly vigilant. This wasn't a comfortable armchair read, it was an active, draining process. So, while you might romanticize the image of the intrepid ghost hunter, consider the profound weariness that was their constant companion, a testament to the extraordinary lengths they went to in their pursuit of the unseen, often at the ultimate cost of their own precious rest. As our journey through the drowsy, gaslit world of Victorian ghost hunters draws to a close, you now reflect on their lasting legacy. These peculiar, often exhausted, individuals, with their earnest curiosity and their unusual sleep habits, may seem like relics of a bygone era, but their influence on our understanding, or indeed, misunderstanding, of the paranormal continues to reverberate. You're observing the faint echo of their efforts in the modern world. Mainstream historical fact, the efforts of Victorian psychical researchers and ghost hunters, despite their often inconclusive findings, laid some of the groundwork for what would eventually become the field of parapsychology. They popularized concepts like telepathy, clairvoyance, and spirit communication, and their methods, albeit rudimentary, represented early attempts to apply empirical observation to subjective experiences. While much of their work is now seen through a skeptical lens, they undeniably sparked a scientific and public conversation about consciousness, death, and the boundaries of human experience that continues to this day. You can trace a direct line from those chilly, gaslit seances to modern-day ghost hunting shows, though hopefully with better sleep schedules and fewer flower traps. The very notion of a haunted house as a concept owes much to their detailed investigations and public fascination. The specific types of phenomena attributed to ghosts, raps, moving objects, disembodied voices, were meticulously documented and popularized by these early seekers. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, the Victorian ghost hunters' meticulous, if flawed, record-keeping, including those dream diaries and detailed reports of apparitions, provided an invaluable, if often biased, archive of paranormal claims that modern researchers still consult. Imagine going through dusty boxes of 19th-century accounts, full of scribbled notes about cold spots and strange whispers, all documented by someone who was likely running on 3 hours of broken sleep. It's certainly a unique form of historical data. Their struggles with the elusive nature of evidence, the constant battle against fraud, and the limitations of their own perceptions continue to inform how we approach such phenomena. Historians still argue whether their contributions were primarily about advancing a pseudoscience or about inadvertently contributing to the development of psychology and sociology by documenting human belief systems and anxieties. Perhaps it was both, a messy, human attempt to grapple with existential questions in an age of rapid change. You might consider how their pursuit of the supernatural, even when sleep-deprived, pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable scientific inquiry, forcing a re-evaluation of the purely materialistic worldview. The enduring image of the Victorian ghost hunter, a figure wrapped in mystery, driven by an insatiable curiosity, and often looking rather tired, remains a powerful one. They remind us that the human need to understand what lies beyond death, to connect with the unseen, is a timeless one. Their willingness to sacrifice comfort, reputation, and precious sleep in pursuit of these answers speaks to a profound human yearning. Remember their strategic naps, their long vigils, the sheer exhaustion etched into their faces. It all contributed to the unique tapestry of their lives and their peculiar contributions to history. Their legacy, then, is not just in the records they left behind, but in the questions they continue to pose. Questions about belief, perception, the nature of reality, and the limits of scientific explanation. And perhaps, as you drift off, you can appreciate the quiet dedication of these sleepy seekers, forever chasing whispers in the dark, reminding us that sometimes, the most profound mysteries are found not in the grand pronouncements, but in the subtle creaks of an old house, or the flickering shadows of a gaslit room, especially when viewed through the heavy-lidded eyes of a truly exhausted, yet infinitely curious, mind. The soft hum of the fan seems to slow now, almost merging with the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. The vivid images of gaslight, velvet, and the determined faces of Victorian ghost hunters begin to blur at the edges, softening into an indistinct tapestry. You feel the weight of history, not as a burden, but as a calming presence, dissolving into the quiet comfort of the present moment. The endless nights of restless waiting, the urgent whispers of the mediums, the creaking floorboards of haunted manors, they all recede, becoming distant echoes in the growing stillness. Your eyelids feel heavy, a pleasant weight settling over them. The peculiar sleep habits of those bygone individuals, their search for answers in the liminal spaces between waking and dreams, now serve only to guide you gently toward your own peaceful slumber. Let the last lingering thoughts of Victorian spiritualism fade, like smoke from a snuffed candle. There is nothing left to observe, nothing left to decipher, only the deepening quiet of the night. You are safe, you are warm, and the mysteries of the past can now simply dissolve into the quiet certainty of rest. Just breathe, slowly, deeply. Let go.